Hey, what is up everyone? This is Lucas. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to have a look at my process for blending flash and ambient frames together to create a well-balanced property interior photograph. So I'm going to go through one example here. I'm going to be using Capture One to edit my raw files and then process everything in Photoshop to put the photograph together. So without further ado, let's jump into Capture One and let's get these edited. Okay, so I have 10 photographs all together. I'm not sure if I'm going to use all the frames, but just in case I have these available to me. First one here is my ambient frame. And to be honest, this is straight out of the camera. It looks pretty okay. The first thing I want to do is lens corrections and also my ICC profile. I shoot with Sony a7 III, so my ICC profile is set to Sony a7 Mark III Pro Standard and the curve is currently set to auto. I do actually like two curves here. One is film extra shadow. This is typically if I need a lot of dynamic range. Increases those shadows a little bit, but for the time being I'm going to use film standard, which is a little bit more contrasty, and this is actually what the auto profile is selecting by default. Next, for the lens corrections, I'm shooting with Sony FE12-24 f4 lens, and I do prefer to change this one to manufacturer profile. I enable chromatic aberration, diffraction correction, and also hide distorted areas. And I would typically adjust the light fall off as well. As you can see, as I pull it up and down here, you can see the sides of the image are becoming brighter. So those typically are darker where you have this kind of vignetting. So I like to put it to somewhere maybe around 20 to 30 or so. And that's about it for our lens correction. Let's go to our adjustments. First, I'm going to start in the high dynamic range. I'm going to press Ctrl E, which enables the exposure warnings so I can see the overexposed areas and crushed shadows. First thing I'm going to do is just drop the whites. And as you can see, that recovers quite a bit of it. It actually affects only the end part of the histogram here on the right hand side, and then I'm going to drop the highlights a little bit as well. Maybe I guess minus 20 should be okay here. Next, I want to increase our shadows. I don't want to overdo it. Capture One actually restores shadows quite a bit, and you can very quickly get very washed out look, or maybe HDR if you go too far with it. But for me, typically maybe around 20, or in this case, I'll maybe do even 15, a more contrasty look here. Next, I'm going to drop blacks probably by around minus 10. And let's go down to clarity. The method I prefer is natural, but you also have punch, neutral, and classic. Again, for me, the natural kind of looks good. With clarity, I like to go kind of all the way to the extreme 100 and then back to minus 100 so you can see how it affects the image. And I think somewhere around 8 looks okay for me. And finally, maybe I'll add a little bit of contrast. Again, this is one of those where I like to go maybe up to the extreme to see how it affects the image and see kind of where I like it to be sitting at. And I think we're going to keep it maybe around 5. So not a big change here, but adds a little bit of the punch. Next, let's go and adjust our sharpness. Capture One's default settings are already quite a bit punchy and very sharp. I do, however, prefer to keep it somewhere around 200 to 220, and I like to increase radius to 1, and that's about it. Now what I'm going to do is copy the adjustments, Shift Control C. I'm going to select everything and press Control Shift V to paste those settings. Okay, so now let's go through all the frames and make final adjustments dependent on what each frame is supposed to do in our final image. We have our ambient, the main frame, so that's all done. We're going to leave it as it is. The next one, what I was thinking about is basically the right-hand side view from the window. So for that, what I might do is drop the exposure here a little bit and then the highlights. I think we'll have to change the white balance so this looks much better. It's much warmer, but to me it looks a little bit green. So I'm going to add a little bit of magenta here. I think that'll do. The next frame, so actually these two are for the window on the left hand side. We don't really need to do much with that window. The view from it is not best anyway. However, for the purposes of the video and wanting to have a fully balanced photograph, we're going to make the adjustments and see in the end if we want to put it in our blend. So what I'm going to do, this one here is the brighter. So this is basically for the house here. I'm just going to remove the exposure warnings. I'm going to drop highlights a little bit and increase shadows. And then what I want to do is just add a little bit of warmth into the frame. So I think that looks pretty okay. And now we can probably copy the settings and paste it into the next one. However, for this one, I want the sky to be a little bit cooler. So I'm just going to drop the temperature a little bit. That's about it. The next photo, this is basically to cover the lights here in the ceiling. Again, we don't really need to do much with this one, so we're just going to keep it as it is. And then we have our flash pops. So my idea is basically on the right hand side, as you can see, there's a bit of a window, which is actually a door to the terrace. It is quite a big door, so there's 3 big windows. So the main light comes through those 3 windows, and then we have a little bit on the left hand side window. What I want to do is perhaps use this frame as my main flash pop and build on top of that, mainly because, as you can see, I'm popping the flash from the right side here, and it kind of creates a light going from right to left. The other frames we're going to use to kind of fix any issues and so on. So let's start with getting our white balance. So we can press W, and I'm just gonna go in here. So it's around 4,743, 4,800. Okay, it's around 4,750 here. So I'm just going to settle on that. So that's our white balance. Now I'm going to think if we need to make any adjustments here. I think all in all, we're pretty good. I might drop the exposure by 0.2 or something like that. That's about it. So I'm going to copy all the adjustments and paste into the other flash frames. And let's have a look if we need to make any changes. So this frame is very, very similar. It's just that the flash is popped a little bit from the further back. And then we also have this frame here, which I do like in terms of the shadow, which is a much softer than the hard shadow on this frame or this one. So we're going to use these 3 frames to create our main flash blend. And then we have a pop from the left hand side. This is supposed to mimic the light coming from the window on the left hand side. I think that looks fine. We don't really need to make any adjustments here. And then I took another pop at the back left here, which lights up this area here and also the couch side and the back of those chairs. Now I do want to keep those chairs and those sides in the shadow because it creates much more depth and dimensionality, like this kind of a 3D look. But I want to have this frame just in case if we need to add a little bit details back. Now this might be a little bit too bright, so let's see if we can drop the exposure a little bit further, so maybe by half or so. And let's have a look here. Let's drop brightness as well a little bit. So that's all the adjustments done. Let's export those files into TIFFs and then put it all together in Photoshop. Okay, just before we start, I do have quite a few keyboard shortcuts I use in Photoshop that are totally custom. So I'm going to try put these up on the screen and explain as I'm editing what they do and so on. Please excuse me if I'm going to be going too fast because obviously I'm quite used to some of the keybinds. Secondly, I'm going to be using a tablet and a pen. I just find it much easier in Photoshop to edit. All right, so let's load everything into a stack. Apologies, but for some reason, Photoshop opened some of the dialog boxes on my second monitor, so I might be dragging some of them onto the main screen once in a while. All right, let's load everything here into the stack. And I do have a keyboard shortcut for that, which is Control-Alt-X. But if you don't have it, you can go to File, Scripts, and Load Files into Stack. And then you can select different frames and put them all together into one file, as you can see here. All right, so first thing, I'm going to rename our layers, so it's a little bit easier for you to understand what each one of them is supposed to do. Typically, I don't do that when I'm editing my own photographs. I know what each frame is supposed to do, so I'll just go with the default naming. But for the purposes of this video, let's rename these. First one here is my Ambient. This is the window on the right, so I'm just going to name it window right. We have window left bright, window left dark, and then we have lights. Now the flash layers, I don't think we need to rename. I might just rename the main one to flash, just so we know which one is our base. All right, so I'm going to leave flash layers on the bottom of layer stack, and let's put these together. So let's do a little bit of blending. So I'm going to turn this one on and off and see kind of what I like. So I definitely like that it's a little bit darker here on that wall here, and in general looks a little bit more tamed. So I'm going to press Ctrl F, which adds a black layer mask. And this is, again, just my own keybind for that. And let's change the brush color to white. I'm going to set the flow at 20%. So you can use Shift plus 1, 2, 3, 4, any numbers to kind of select the flow. And then if you use just the numbers on its own, it changes the opacity. I'm going to change opacity of the brush to 20%. So that's Shift plus 2 changes the flow to 20%. And I'm just going to gently draw that in here and get rid of that hot spot over here. And I do apologize for my voice. I'm getting a little bit ill, I think. Now, if I press Shift, I can temporarily disable the layer. So I'm just seeing what's going on here. And I do like the shadow here, so I'm going to keep it as it is. Let's move on to the next frame. So this one, I'm going to move up. I might use it at the end. Let's check the next one. Okay, so from this frame, I definitely like the shadow here. It's much softer than our current shadow here. So it transitions a little bit easier. So I'm just going to paint that in. And then this is supposed to mimic the light coming from the other window. So let's just going to slightly add here, not too much. We still want to have a bit of a shadow. So I really don't need much here. I really do want most of it coming from right. So that looks all right. Do we need this one? So let's hide it. And I'm going to add a little bit of the light here. And actually, I think that looks pretty okay. I'm going to select all of the flash layers, press Ctrl G to group it, and I'm just going to call it flash. And now basically everything inside the group, that's all treated as one layer. I don't tend to flatten layers just because if I need to make any changes, I can go back and make those changes. What tends to happen sometimes, you might use one of the flash frames, and then when you're kind of fixing something later on, you zoom in and you find out that actually there is a part of yourself somewhere in the photo. You need to get it out. But if you flatten everything, it's pretty much clone job or AI removal. So that can be a bit annoying. Now, since we're going to be using this flash frame as base and use the color from it, what I'm going to do is press Ctrl U, which is my custom shortcut for adjustment layer for hue saturation. So next I'm going to press Ctrl Shift R, which is my color range. And with this tool, I can select a particular color. So I have this eyedropper where I hover over, I can select different colors. And at the moment, my selection preview is set to quick mask, which is typically what I prefer, but you can set it to none, and then you can see everything as it is. The only problem with that is that you cannot really see your selections apart from the little preview screen here. And there is really no way of expanding this window. So you can also do it so it shows you the image here in this little preview, and then you can do a quick mask here and kind of get an idea. So that's kind of maybe another way of working. I typically like to put localized color clusters. This basically allows you to select only colors within close vicinity to where you clicked or where you use the eyedropper. If I remove it, as you can see where I pressed on the ceiling here, which is, you know, somewhere around white and bluish, it also selects other parts of the image. These are those not in red, basically. So I do like having localized color clusters on, and I typically set range to maybe around 20%, somewhere between 15 and 20%. And then the fuzziness is basically threshold. So I like it to be somewhere maybe around 15 to 25 or so. So now I've selected this area, but obviously I want to add the others here as well. So you can press and hold shift, and I can just go through the ceiling here, and it's gonna start adding everything to the selection. So really what I want to do is just desaturate the ceiling. Cool thing with this is that it only affects the colors I've selected. So if you look at the lighting here, it didn't select those lights, for example. If I press OK, it will automatically add that mask to hue saturation adjustment layer. Now what I can do is just drop the saturation. As you can see, I'm going to drop it maybe around 50%. So let's just split it in half. I don't really like to go crazy. What I'm going to do as well is press Ctrl G to group that and then make a black mask for that group. So this way I can now press L for my polygonal lasso tool, and I'm just going to zoom in and make a quick selection around these areas. So this will allow us to desaturate just the ceiling. And this is quite easy selection here. If you press shift, it just goes a little bit faster. I'm gonna fill that with white. So we have before and after, and you can see there's not much on it anyway. If I drop all the way, it's a little bit more visible. I'll turn it on and off, on and off. But yeah, I'm gonna keep that at probably -50. Okay, so that's our flash blend. We have the lights here, so I'm just gonna move them at the top. I'm going to change the blending mode to lighten, so it will only let through pixels that are brighter than the layer underneath. Obviously, this is dark here, so if I put this on and it's set to lighten mode, because this layer or lighten layer has those lights here which are brighter, it lets them through. But as you can see, it also lets through other things here. So if I take it on and off, you can see it adds quite a few other things. So I'm just gonna press Ctrl F, which is my shortcut to add a black mask. I'm gonna get my brush tool, make sure it's set to white, and I'm just going to draw in those lights here. Okay. Then we have our ambient. I'm just gonna change it to luminosity. And as you can see, it's at 100%, and it looks pretty decent, mainly because the exposure is quite balanced. It wasn't too crazy. There's no crazy bright and dark areas, so that kind of affects our image much better. I'm just going to turn it off for the time being, and then we have windows. So let's do the window to the right first. I'm just going to press Ctrl F so I can add the mask. Press L for the polygonal lasso tool. Let's zoom in here. And again, let's just make a quick selection. Fortunately, this is very easy. It's just rectangular shapes, so super easy to do using the polygonal lasso tool. If you double click, you can close the selection, and I'm just going to add a little bit here because that was missed. And then we can fill that area with white. And as you can see, the non-flash one, we removed reflections, so that's kind of a additional bonus here. And then let's do similar for these windows here. I'm not being too crazy with accuracy on this. I do have a point for feathering on this, and it should look okay. And if it's not, then we're going to make additional refinements here. As you can see, this area is basically not straight line, so that's a little bit more work here. And then we have our left windows. Again, I'm just going to fill that with white. So what I'm going to do, press Alt and then drag the mask onto the other window layer, so the dark one, and move the dark one on top. So that's where the clouds are. And secondly, if I press and hold Control and then click on the mask, it's going to make a selection. And now going to the adjustment layers, I can select curves, and then we can brighten up this a little bit here. So before, after, so it looks a little bit better, it's not too dark. And then we have the sky here. So what I'm going to do is put it inside a group and put a black layer mask on top. I'm just going to gently paint that in, just to reveal a little bit of that sky. Nothing too crazy. We have a little bit of a better view. I'm just going to group the left window here. And then we have the right window. Again, if I press Control and left click on the layer, it makes a selection. And then if I create adjustment layer while the selection is on, it's going to make a adjustment layer with that mask. So let's add curves. I'm just going to brighten it up here a little bit. And again, do similar things. So I'm just going to double mask it. So put it inside a group and then add a mask to the group. And I'm just going to paint the brighter area here. Okay, and then if we want, we can put both windows inside a group and just call the group windows. I can turn it on and off, and as you can see, it makes a change. So this to me looks too dark. So if we go here, left window, let's add curves, layer adjustment. And if we wanted to affect only that particular group, we just put it above the layer that we want it to be affecting. And then you can use clip button here, or you can press Alt and go in between the both layers and click once, and it's going to clip it to it. And that way it's going to affect only that one layer. So I can just brighten it up here a little bit. I don't want to go too crazy. And then I'm just going to use a black brush and remove a little bit of that brightening on the sky so we can get some details back there. So on and off. I guess the sky is a little bit too dark still, so I'm going to brighten it up a little bit. And I think it looks more or less okay. So the lights are on, and as I said, we have our ambient layer. I'm actually going to drop the opacity, let's see, maybe to around 60, 70%, something like that. Let's settle on 60. And I'm going to add curves adjustment layer. And let's add a little bit of an S-curve just to add a little bit of a crunch to the image. So before and after, before and after. That's pretty much it. Let's add an empty layer. I'm just going to call it Fix. So I do have some sensor dust. I'm just going to change to our healing brush. And if I zoom in here, you can see this sensor dust spot. And I think the ceiling had some form of a leak or something like that. So I'm just going to remove that by copying from an area that's looking okay. I'll just blend this a little bit. So I'm just scanning the image for any things that need to be kind of fixed. So we have this wall here. Maybe we want to fix it a little bit. I really like using the healing brush for kind of fixing walls and so on. It does a pretty good job. You just sample from an area that's looking fine and then go over the areas that need some fixing. So again, I'm just scanning the image for any problematic area. So we have this thing here. What I can do is fix it a little bit at least. So there's some little imperfections here and there on the wall. Again, I'm just being a little bit over the top trying to fix these. They're not too crazy, you know. No one's really going to be zooming in like that most of the time. But it's a good practice to have these resolved. Okay, so I think more or less I'm happy with that. One other little problem I see is this kind of a discoloration here. It's much more blue than the other areas, which are kind of blue-gray. So I'm going to create another layer, call it color, and I'm going to change the blending mode to color as well. Select my brush tool, and I'm just going to sample from area that has kind of a correct color. And then if I swap the colors, as you can see here, these are different. Not too far away from each other, but definitely noticeable. So I'm just going to gently paint over. And that definitely made a pretty good change. You can kind of drop the opacity as well if you don't want it to be crazy. I think we're okay here. Next, we can actually add a little bit more contrast, and for that there's quite a few different tools. We can do it directly in Photoshop, in Lightroom as well. However, I do like Nik Color Efex from DxO, so that's what we're going to use here. Let's merge everything into a new layer. That's Shift Control Alt E, and then under Filter, Nik Collection 7, let's go into Color Efex. And I do have few presets here. I'm just going to go for one of the latest ones. That's maybe a little bit too much, but I'm just going to apply that and drop the opacity here a little bit. So let's try maybe something like 70%. Maybe still quite a bit strong, maybe 55. And then let's also add some sharpening while we're at it. So under Filter, Nik Collection 7, let's go to Sharpener Output. And I'm just going to 1:1 zoom. Okay, and this looks quite strong here. So I'm just going to drop the sharpening strength maybe to around 30% or so. So a little bit of structure, local contrast. So very small numbers here. Okay, that looks all right. Let's apply that. Let's keep it maybe at around 70%. And that's pretty much everything. The last thing is to make the final adjustments. We can either do that in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. So I'm just going to use Adobe Camera Raw filter. And let's go to light, let's drop highlights a little bit, but then increase white, so that's going to give us a little bit more punch. Let's look at blacks. We increase shadows a little bit, and for the most part that looks okay. Let's go to geometry and let's use guided, and I'm going to select kind of 2 vertical lines as far as on the sides of the photo as possible. So that's our verticals, and then let's do horizontal. We can maybe use those lights at the top here. And then for the bottom, maybe we can use the wooden flooring here. Let's see. All right. So off and on. Let's see if we can add a little bit of clarity. Not much. I think these are okay. Alright, so this is my basic process for blending flash and natural light layers together. It might look fairly complicated at first, however, once you get some time in and practice a little bit, it becomes fairly easy. And as I said, I used quite a few layers here that probably I didn't really need to. So it was probably more complicated than it really should have been. I plan on making some tutorials and also my editing sessions. So if you're interested in this type of content, please make sure you subscribe. Until then, I'll see you later.